In the tight-knit community of Birmingham, Alabama, Pastor Elijah Brooks was more than just a spiritual leader. He was a pillar of strength, a beacon of faith, and a man trusted by all. His congregation saw him as the guiding hand, the shepherd of their souls. His words, powerful and comforting, echoing through the halls of the church. But all that changed just days before Easter Sunday. Rebecca, his beloved wife, vanished without a trace. It was supposed to be a time of hope, of renewal, a time when families came together to celebrate, to reflect. Instead, the town was struck by a storm of confusion, fear, and disbelief. How could someone so integral to their community, someone with a reputation of such profound trust, be at the center of such a mystery? For days, Pastor Brooks pleaded for help, his voice cracking with emotion as he spoke to the media, desperately searching for his wife. But even in the midst of his grief, something didn't feel right. Was he truly the broken man he appeared to be, or was there something he was hiding behind those tearful eyes? As the days passed and the investigation into Rebecca's disappearance deepened, shocking truths began to surface. What had once seemed like a tragedy quickly spiraled into something far darker, a tale of betrayal, secrets, and lies buried deep beneath the surface. The beloved pastor, the man who had been the face of faith in Birmingham, was not who he appeared to be. And as the community would soon learn, the truth behind his wife's disappearance would shake their trust in him to its very core. The questions remained. Where was Rebecca? And just how well did anyone really know Pastor Elijah Brooks? To understand the shock wave that would soon ripple through Birmingham, we must first understand Pastor Elijah Brooks, the man who was revered, the man who held the trust of an entire community. Pastor Brooks had lived in Birmingham for over a decade, his ministry a cornerstone of the church and the town. He was known for his commanding presence, his powerful sermons, and his unwavering commitment to his congregation. To the people who sat in the pews, listening intently to his every word, Elijah Brooks wasn't just a pastor. He was a friend, a confidant, a man who cared deeply for the well-being of each soul under his roof. His church wasn't merely a place of worship. It was a sanctuary, a second home for many, and Pastor Brooks was the heart that beat within it. Rebecca, his wife, was as much a part of this image as he was. A gentle and kind woman, Rebecca was often seen by her husband's side, a quiet strength beside the man who led their flock. Together, they were the perfect couple, always in sync, always supportive, a testament to the power of love and faith. Their marriage was the stuff of dreams, or so it seemed. But there was a lot more happening behind the scenes, behind the polished exterior of their perfect life. Beneath the veneer of their harmonious marriage, there were cracks that only those closest to the couple could begin to understand. Theirs was not a fairy tale. It was a partnership built on faith, yes, but also on expectations, secrets, and unresolved tensions. Elijah Brooks had grown from a young, aspiring preacher into a man of influence. The church had flourished under his guidance, and his financial responsibilities grew along with it. The funds that flowed into the church were substantial, and the community relied on his stewardship. But with great influence came great temptation, And there were whispers of financial mismanagement, whispers of money that didn't quite add up. But these were just whispers, murmurs in the dark. To the congregation, he was a man beyond reproach. As the years went by, Pastor Brooks' reputation continued to grow. He was a man admired not just for his religious teachings, but for his ability to bring people together. He was a leader in the truest sense of the word, a man who commanded respect, and for many, love. But even in a community as tight-knit as this one, there are always those who see more than what's on the surface. Rebecca, on the other hand, was a quieter figure. Her role was to support, to nurture, and to love her husband in his grand mission. But she also had her own doubts about the way their lives had been heading, doubts about the cost of the secrets they kept. What had once been a passionate, devoted marriage was beginning to fray at the edges. The cracks, however, were hidden well, covered up by the image of a couple united in purpose, their bond seeming unbreakable. But for those close enough to see, something wasn't right. The chemistry they once shared had begun to fade, and Pastor Brooks, despite his outward charm, was a man harboring much more than the town ever knew. To understand the depths of the tragedy that would soon unfold, we must take a closer look at the relationship between Pastor Elijah Brooks and his wife, Rebecca. On the surface, their marriage appeared to be the epitome of faith and devotion. They were seen as a power couple in their community. Elijah, the charismatic preacher, and Rebecca, his quiet but unwavering support. They were partners, both in life and in ministry, a duo that embodied the ideals of love, loyalty, and trust. But like many couples, the reality of their relationship was far more complicated than it appeared. Rebecca had always been the more reserved of the two. She had a calm, nurturing presence that balanced Elijah's fiery passion for the church and his ministry. While Pastor Brooks captivated his congregation with his powerful words, Rebecca worked behind the scenes, helping organize church events, supporting the children's programs, and being a quiet, yet steadfast, presence at his side. In many ways, she was the glue that held the church together. But as the years went by, cracks began to form in the foundation of their marriage. Rebecca had begun to feel a distance, an unspoken gap that grew wider with each passing day. She knew that Elijah's responsibilities had grown, both within the church and in the community. But what started as a growing ambition had morphed into something darker, something less transparent. The secrets Pastor Brooks kept, the ones that Rebecca only glimpsed but couldn't fully understand, began to weigh heavily on their once perfect union. Despite the love they had for each other, there were moments when Rebecca questioned their life together. She had become suspicious of the way Elijah handled church finances, of the strange late nights and phone calls that were never fully explained. It wasn't just the money that troubled her. It was the way his attention was divided, the way his focus seemed to shift from their family to the church. There were whispers of infidelity, of affairs Elijah had kept hidden. And although Rebecca never had proof, her instincts told her something was wrong. And then there were the letters. A number of church members had received anonymous, threatening letters. Letters that referenced financial mismanagement and personal indiscretions. At first, they had seemed like an empty threat, just someone trying to shake the church's foundation. But as more letters appeared, the tension began to mount. Some of the letters hinted at things only Elijah would know, secrets that shouldn't have been revealed. Rebecca, caught between loyalty to her husband and the nagging suspicion that something was terribly wrong, began to feel trapped. In the quiet moments of their marriage, Rebecca had tried to address her concerns with Elijah, but his responses were always dismissive, brushing off her fears with a charming smile and an assurance that everything was fine. But the smile never quite reached his eyes, and the reassurances only seemed to make her doubts grow. Their once deep connection, built on years of shared faith and a mutual love for their community, was slowly unraveling, thread by thread. But in public, everything remained pristine. The Brooks family was still the picture of devotion. There was no hint of the growing rift between them. To the congregation, they were the model couple, the perfect pair leading the flock. But behind closed doors, Rebecca knew the truth. Her marriage was no longer what it seemed. In hindsight, it seemed as though the lies and secrets Pastor Brooks kept had already planted the seeds of his downfall. The stage had been set long before Easter Sunday, but Rebecca had no idea just how dangerous the consequences would be. Easter Sunday was supposed to be a time of renewal, a time of joy and celebration for the community of Birmingham. But instead, it became the day everything changed. Just days before the church's most sacred holiday, Rebecca Brooks, Pastor Elijah Brooks' wife, vanished without a trace. It was a disappearance that stunned everyone. One moment, Rebecca was helping prepare the church for the Easter service. The next, she was gone. The absence of her gentle presence was felt immediately, leaving an emptiness in the hearts of those who knew her. The congregation, already familiar with the Brooks family's devotion, struggled to comprehend what had happened. Was it an accident? Did she leave of her own accord? Or was there something far more sinister at play? Pastor Brooks, visibly distraught, took to the pulpit in a state of anguish, pleading for his wife's safe return. His voice cracked with emotion as he spoke to his congregation, describing how he had searched for Rebecca tirelessly, how he'd called her cell phone only to hear the endless ringing. His face was a mask of concern, but some began to question whether this was genuine grief or something else entirely. A few members of the congregation, especially those close to the couple, started to feel uneasy. There was a palpable sense that something wasn't right. While most of the community rallied around Pastor Brooks, offering support and prayers, a few began to whisper, "Why had Rebecca left? Why had there been no sign of a struggle? Could it be possible that she simply disappeared on her own, or was there something far more troubling hiding beneath the surface?" The initial response from law enforcement was swift. They began canvassing the area around the church, searching for any trace of Rebecca. As days passed, the investigation grew more focused. Friends and family were interviewed and all leads were followed, but no clues emerged to explain her sudden absence. It was as though Rebecca had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind. However, something stood out: Pastor Brooks. His public grief seemed real, but detectives were starting to notice subtle inconsistencies in his story. The timeline didn't add up. He claimed to have been desperately searching for Rebecca, but some witnesses reported that they hadn't seen him searching at all. And there was something else, a nagging feeling that the more they looked into Elijah Brooks' life, the more they began to see that the man he presented to the world was not the man he really was. For a community that had always trusted Pastor Brooks with their hearts, this sudden disappearance raised uncomfortable questions. What was the pastor hiding? Was there something more to Rebecca's disappearance than met the eye? And could the answers to these questions lead them into a much darker place than they had ever imagined? In the days following her disappearance, the investigation shifted from a missing persons case to something far more complicated, a search for the truth that no one could have expected. And as the community of Birmingham waited for answers, the truth about the man they all trusted would begin to unravel, revealing a life of deception and betrayal. As the days stretched into weeks, the investigation into Rebecca Brooks' disappearance began to shift in ways no one expected. What initially seemed like a straightforward missing persons case soon revealed troubling inconsistencies. Pastor Elijah Brooks, the beloved figurehead of the community, was no longer just the grieving husband. He was emerging as a man with hidden layers, a man whose life had been far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Detectives began to dig deeper into the financials of the church. It was a necessary step, as the records had always been handled by Pastor Brooks himself. To the outside world, the church was thriving, its mission expanded, its congregation grew, and donations poured in. But behind the scenes, the picture painted a different story. It was soon discovered that a significant amount of church funds had gone missing, money that had been earmarked for community outreach, for the very programs that made the church such an integral part of the town. The missing funds, however, had never been accounted for. The deeper the investigation went, the more questions arose. Church staff members, who had once adored their pastor, began to feel uneasy about the missing money. There were murmurs that Pastor Brooks had been living beyond his means, spending lavishly on personal luxuries, with some church members even reporting that he had been seen frequenting upscale hotels and restaurants when he should have been focused on his ministry. The weight of these accusations cast a dark shadow over a man who had once been held in such high regard. But the financial secrets were just the beginning. It didn't take long for detectives to uncover another shocking element. Pastor Brooks had been having multiple affairs. These were not just whispers from disgruntled church members. They were documented. Secretive meetings, hidden phone calls, and discreet hotel stays. It was a pattern that had been going on for years, and no one had suspected a thing, not even Rebecca. But there was more. Some of the threatening letters, once thought to be the work of an angry parishioner, now appeared to have a connection to Pastor Brooks. The letters referenced not only his financial misdeeds, but also hinted at personal betrayals. Betrayals that only he and Rebecca would know. It became clear that these letters were not just random threats, but messages from someone with intimate knowledge of his life. Were they a warning to stop, or were they meant to expose a much darker truth? As the investigation continued, it became painfully clear that Rebecca's disappearance might not have been an accident at all. With each new discovery, the evidence began to point to one man, Pastor Elijah Brooks. His once untouchable reputation had crumbled. Those who had trusted him most now found themselves questioning everything they knew about the man who had led their church, their community, their very lives. For those close to the case, the feeling was impossible to ignore. They were getting closer, closer to a truth that would not only shatter their faith in the man they once admired, but expose the terrifying depths of betrayal that had been hidden right under their noses. And yet, in the midst of it all, Pastor Brooks remained composed. His public appearances, while less frequent, showed no signs of distress. His calm demeanor seemed almost too controlled, too rehearsed. It was as if he had anticipated this all along, prepared for the eventual unraveling of his double life. As detectives pieced together the fragments of evidence, they realized they were dealing with a man who had carefully crafted an illusion of goodness, a man who had fooled an entire community, including his own wife, into believing he was the model of integrity. The deeper they went, the more unsettling the truth became. Pastor Brooks had created a web of deceit so tangled that it was difficult to know where the lies began and the truth ended. What was once a straightforward missing persons case was rapidly turning into a nightmare of betrayal, crime, and manipulation, a nightmare that had only just begun to unfold. The truth about Pastor Elijah Brooks was unraveling at an unstoppable pace. What had once been a beloved, respected figure in the community was now being exposed as a man whose dark secrets far outweighed his public persona. But it wasn't until a crucial breakthrough came in the form of an unexpected confession that the full depth of his betrayal was revealed. The breakthrough came when an anonymous source, someone from within the church, came forward with information that would change everything. This whistleblower, a church member who had worked closely with Pastor Brooks on various church projects, provided crucial evidence that tied him directly to the financial mismanagement and the threatening letters that had surfaced over the past few months. The source had kept quiet out of fear of retribution, fear of the pastor's influence. But with the weight of the investigation mounting, they could no longer remain silent. Through this confession, detectives learned that the missing funds had not been an innocent mistake or a series of accounting errors. No, the money had been deliberately siphoned off over years, hidden through a network of shell accounts and personal spending. Pastor Brooks had taken the church's funds and used them for personal gain, luxurious vacations, expensive gifts, and secretive meetings with women who had no place in his marriage. He had lied to his congregation, deceived them, and manipulated them into believing he was the faithful leader they had trusted him to be. But the most shocking revelation came when the anonymous source revealed something far more sinister, something that connected directly to Rebecca's disappearance. It turned out that the last time anyone saw Rebecca alive, she had confronted Pastor Brooks. The whistleblower revealed that Rebecca had discovered the affair and the financial fraud, and in a heated argument, she had threatened to expose him. The confrontation had taken place the night before she disappeared, and it was clear that Rebecca had been prepared to confront her husband about his lies and to take the matter to the police. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. What had seemed like a missing persons case was now being viewed as something much darker, an act of desperation, a crime that stemmed from years of deceit and betrayal. Rebecca's disappearance was no longer a mystery. It was a murder. The investigation had gone from a missing persons case to one of cold-blooded murder. Pastor Brooks, once the cherished leader of the community, was now a suspect in his wife's disappearance, and the evidence was mounting against him. As detectives moved to arrest Pastor Brooks, they discovered another chilling detail. Hidden among his personal belongings was a collection of threatening letters, not the ones sent to the congregation, but ones he had written himself, detailing his plans to silence anyone who stood in his way. They were letters of intimidation, warnings to those who threatened to expose him. And as the letters unfolded, it became clear that Rebecca had been at the center of his fears. She had become a liability, someone who knew too much, someone he couldn't afford to let live. The community, who had once viewed Pastor Brooks as a godly figure, was now forced to confront the brutal reality. Their leader was a murderer. The carefully crafted image of a man of faith, a man they had placed their trust in, had been nothing more than a lie. The truth was devastating. Rebecca's life had been taken by the very man she had loved and stood beside for years. The community, who had once viewed Pastor Brooks as a godly figure, was now forced to confront the brutal reality. Their leader was a murderer. The carefully crafted image of a man of faith, a man they had placed their trust in, had been nothing more than a lie. The truth was devastating. Rebecca's life had been taken by the very man she had loved and stood beside for years. And yet, in the midst of it all, Pastor Brooks remained composed. His public appearances, while less frequent, showed no signs of distress. His calm demeanor seemed almost too controlled, too rehearsed. It was as if he had anticipated this all along, prepared for the eventual unraveling of his double life. As detectives pieced together the fragments of evidence, they realized they were dealing with a man who had carefully crafted an illusion of goodness, a man who had fooled an entire community, including his own wife, into believing he was the model of integrity. The deeper they went, the more unsettling the truth became. Pastor Brooks had created a web of deceit so tangled that it was difficult to know where the lies began and the truth ended. What was once a straightforward missing persons case was rapidly turning into a nightmare of betrayal, crime, and manipulation, a nightmare that had only just begun to unfold. The truth about Pastor Elijah Brooks was unraveling at an unstoppable pace. What had once been a beloved, respected figure in the community was now being exposed as a man whose dark secrets far outweighed his public persona. But it wasn't until a crucial breakthrough came in the form of an unexpected confession that the full depth of his betrayal was revealed. The breakthrough came when an anonymous source, someone from within the church, came forward with information that would change everything. This whistleblower, a church member who had worked closely with Pastor Brooks on various church projects, provided crucial evidence that tied him directly to the financial mismanagement and the threatening letters that had surfaced over the past few months. The source had kept quiet out of fear of retribution, fear of the pastor's influence. But with the weight of the investigation mounting, they could no longer remain silent. Through this confession, detectives learned that the missing funds had not been an innocent mistake or a series of accounting errors. No, the money had been deliberately siphoned off over years, hidden through a network of shell accounts and personal spending. Pastor Brooks had taken the church's funds and used them for personal gain, luxurious vacations, expensive gifts, and secretive meetings with women who had no place in his marriage. He had lied to his congregation, deceived them, and manipulated them into believing he was the faithful leader they had trusted him to be. But the most shocking revelation came when the anonymous source revealed something far more sinister, something that connected directly to Rebecca's disappearance. It turned out that the last time anyone saw Rebecca alive, she had confronted Pastor Brooks. The whistleblower revealed that Rebecca had discovered the affair and the financial fraud, and in a heated argument, she had threatened to expose him. The confrontation had taken place the night before she disappeared, and it was clear that Rebecca had been prepared to confront her husband about his lies and to take the matter to the police. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. What had seemed like a missing persons case was now being viewed as something much darker, an act of desperation, a crime that stemmed from years of deceit and betrayal. Rebecca's disappearance was no longer a mystery. It was a murder. The investigation had gone from a missing persons case to one of cold-blooded murder. Pastor Brooks, once the cherished leader of the community, was now a suspect in his wife's disappearance, and the evidence was mounting against him. As detectives moved to arrest Pastor Brooks, they discovered another chilling detail. Hidden among his personal belongings was a collection of threatening letters, not the ones sent to the congregation, but ones he had written himself, detailing his plans to silence anyone who stood in his way. They were letters of intimidation, warnings to those who threatened to expose him. And as the letters unfolded, it became clear that Rebecca had been at the center of his fears. She had become a liability, someone who knew too much, someone he couldn't afford to let live. The community, who had once viewed Pastor Brooks as a godly figure, was now forced to confront the brutal reality. Their leader was a murderer. The carefully crafted image of a man of faith, a man they had placed their trust in, had been nothing more than a lie. The truth was devastating. Rebecca's life had been taken by the very man she had loved and stood beside for years. The verdict came swiftly. Pastor Brooks was found guilty of first-degree murder. The man who had once been a leader of the faithful was now a convicted killer. The sentence was a fitting one: life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away to prison, the silence that followed was deafening. The community, once united by faith, was now a fractured shadow of its former self. The trust that had been so deeply embedded in the heart of their congregation was gone, and in its place was a bitter realization. The man they had followed, the man they had trusted, had been hiding a darkness far deeper than they could have ever imagined. The town of Birmingham would never be the same. The loss of Rebecca was a tragedy in itself, but the betrayal of the man who had stood at the pulpit for so many years left a scar that would take generations to heal. As the days passed and Pastor Elijah Brooks was left to grapple with the consequences of his own actions, the investigation into Rebecca's disappearance deepened, moving from the initial stages of uncertainty to the hard, unyielding discovery of truth. What had begun as a missing persons case quickly evolved into a full-scale criminal investigation. Detective Sarah Williams, A seasoned investigator with a sharp eye for detail took charge of the case. Detective Williams was no stranger to difficult cases, but this one struck a personal chord. She had grown up in Birmingham and had known of Pastor Brooks, though she had never been part of his congregation. She had always been wary of figures like him, men whose power and influence could blind an entire community. But even she had to admit, she was taken aback by the scope of the deception she was about to uncover. The first step in the investigation was to retrace Rebecca's last known movements. The day she disappeared, Rebecca had been at the church preparing for the Easter Sunday service, as she had done so many times before. But after her last sighting, there was no trace of her. No phone calls, no messages, and no sign of struggle in the church or her home. Pastor Brooks claimed that he had been searching for her frantically after noticing she was missing, but the timeline didn't add up. Surveillance footage from the church showed Brooks leaving the building alone in the early hours of the morning, but there was no sign of Rebecca. Detective Williams knew that something wasn't right. The absence of evidence was telling. When someone goes missing under such circumstances, there's usually something, a clue, a conversation, a conflict, that can point investigators in the right direction. But for Rebecca, there was nothing. The silence was deafening, and it only deepened the suspicion surrounding Pastor Brooks. As the investigation continued, the financial records of the church became a critical point of focus. Detective Williams and her team worked alongside forensic accountants to go over every document, every transaction, every dollar that flowed in and out of the church's accounts. What they found was disturbing. Funds that had been earmarked for community programs, for outreach, for the church's upkeep, had mysteriously disappeared. A large portion had been transferred into personal accounts that were not under the church's name, but under Pastor Brooks' personal control. The pattern of theft was clear. Over the course of several years, large sums of money had been siphoned off. At first, it seemed like small amounts, enough to be overlooked. But as the investigation progressed, it became apparent that Pastor Brooks had been taking larger and larger sums for himself. The accounts linked to him painted a picture of a man living far beyond his means. Lavish vacations, high-end restaurants, and hotel stays. It seemed that Pastor Brooks had been using the church's funds to fund his own personal desires, all while maintaining the facade of a humble, godly pastor. But the financial crimes were only part of the story. The most chilling discovery came when the investigators turned their attention to the threatening letters that had been sent to members of the congregation. The letters had initially been dismissed as the work of an anonymous, disgruntled churchgoer. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that they were much more than that. One of the letters, which had been sent to Rebecca herself, stood out. It referenced not only Pastor Brooks' embezzlement, but also his infidelities, which had been a well-kept secret. The letter was a warning, a veiled threat aimed at silencing those who knew too much. Detective Williams now believed that Rebecca had discovered the truth about her husband's crimes and was prepared to confront him. The argument, the confrontation, had likely led to her tragic end. There was still no sign of Rebecca, and despite the mounting evidence against Pastor Brooks, Her whereabouts remained a mystery. But with each new discovery, each new piece of evidence that came to light, the truth about Pastor Brooks became harder to deny. He had stolen from the very people who had trusted him. He had lied to his wife, his congregation, and the entire town. With a growing body of evidence, Pastor Brooks' role in his wife's disappearance became increasingly clear. Detective Williams' team had pieced together the timeline, connected the financial records, and identified the threats. Now, it was time to confront the man who had once been a symbol of righteousness. The investigation was far from over, but the truth was closing in, and the community of Birmingham was about to face a revelation that would forever alter their understanding of the man they had revered. When Pastor Elijah Brooks was convicted of the murder of his wife, Rebecca, the consequences rippled through the entire city of Birmingham. What had started as a mystery, with whispers and doubts about his involvement, now became undeniable. The truth was exposed, and the once admired pastor was no longer a beacon of faith. He was a criminal, a murderer, and a thief. The trial was a media sensation. The courtroom, once reserved for ordinary cases, now became the center of a storm. Reporters from across the country flocked to Birmingham, eager to witness the trial of the man who had once stood at the pulpit, preaching to thousands of faithful followers. The public was captivated by the story. How could someone like Pastor Brooks, so trusted and respected, have been capable of such a heinous act? The community's shock turned to anger as more details emerged. It was clear now. Rebecca's life had been taken not just because of a momentary lapse of judgment, but because of years of deception and betrayal. As Pastor Brooks sat in the courtroom, a man who had once commanded reverence, the silence was deafening. His calm demeanor, which had served him so well in public, was now a chilling reminder of the man behind the mask. The defense team tried to argue that Pastor Brooks had been driven to act out of desperation, that the pressures of his dual life, his public role as a spiritual leader and his private life of secrets, had overwhelmed him. But the prosecution's case was strong, supported by the overwhelming evidence of financial crimes, threatening letters, and a timeline that linked Pastor Brooks directly to the day Rebecca vanished. When the guilty verdict was read, it echoed through the courtroom, and a heavy weight seemed to settle over the entire community. Life sentences were handed down, not just for the murder, but also for the theft of the church's funds. Pastor Brooks was condemned to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never again be able to prey on the trust of others, never again stand in a pulpit to deceive those who believed in him. For the congregation that had once adored him, the consequences were far-reaching. Some chose to stand by him, clinging to the idea that their pastor had been a good man who had simply made a terrible mistake. But for most, there was no coming back from the betrayal. Members who had been with the church from its very inception found themselves in a state of shock, questioning everything they had once believed. Was their faith misplaced? Had they been wrong to trust him? These questions lingered in the hearts of those who had once held Pastor Brooks in the highest regard. The church, which had once flourished under his leadership, now faced a grim future. Donations dwindled and many families left, seeking new places of worship where they could rebuild their faith. The leadership of the church was thrown into turmoil as those left behind tried to pick up the pieces of a shattered institution. The damage done was not just financial, it was spiritual. Trust had been shattered, and it would take years, if not decades, to heal the wounds that Pastor Brooks had inflicted on the community. Rebecca's family, meanwhile, had to confront their own grief. Her death was a personal tragedy, but it had also become a public spectacle. They had lost a daughter, a sister, a friend, but now they were forced to live through the pain of knowing that the person responsible was someone who had been close to them, someone who had been loved and trusted by all. Their grief was compounded by the overwhelming sense of betrayal that accompanied it. The woman they had lost had been more than just a wife. She had been a victim of manipulation and deceit. As the dust began to settle, the consequences of Pastor Brooks' actions became all too real. The community of Birmingham would never be the same. The legacy of his betrayal would haunt the church and its members for years to come. And for Pastor Brooks, life in prison was a small price to pay for the destruction he had caused. But the consequences weren't just for those directly affected. The entire city had to grapple with a fundamental question. How could they have been so blind to the signs? Pastor Brooks had stood in front of them, day after day, offering comfort and guidance. He had been the man they turned to in times of crisis. And yet, they never saw the darkness lurking beneath the surface. The cost of misplaced trust was steep. For Pastor Brooks, it was his freedom, his reputation, and his life. For Rebecca, it was her life, cut short by the man who had promised to love and protect her. And for the community, it was their faith, forever altered by the betrayal of the one person they had trusted most. The story of Pastor Elijah Brooks is one of heartbreaking betrayal, a man entrusted with the deepest faith of a community, only to destroy it with his own greed and lies. It serves as a painful reminder of how trust, once broken, can leave lasting scars, not just on the victims, but on an entire community. Pastor Brooks' story isn't just about one man's descent into darkness, but about the very human capacity to deceive, to manipulate, and to hide our true selves behind a mask of righteousness. As we reflect on the events that led to Rebecca's tragic death, we must ask ourselves, how often do we place trust in those who stand before us, cloaked in authority and power? Are we paying attention to the signs, the red flags that might be hidden behind a smile or a well-crafted sermon? Pastor Brooks was able to deceive an entire community because they believed in him, because they trusted him with their hearts. But that trust, once shattered, led to a chain of events that no one could have predicted. For the community of Birmingham, the road to healing will be long. How do you rebuild faith after it's been so violently torn away? How do you move forward when your very foundation has been rocked to its core? These are questions that will continue to echo through the lives of those left behind. Questions that no amount of time can fully answer. But this story is not just a tragedy. It's a cautionary tale. It reminds us that the truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how deep the lies are buried. And it challenges us to look beyond the surface, to question those who hold power, and to trust our instincts, even when the truth is uncomfortable. What do you think? How could this tragedy have been avoided? Do you think the signs were there all along? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on this story and the lessons it teaches us about trust, deception, and the consequences of our actions. If you found this story compelling, be sure to subscribe to Beyond the Evidence for more in-depth true crime stories and investigative documentaries. We dive deep into the evidence, uncovering the hidden truths behind the headlines. Don't miss out. Hit the subscribe button and join us as we continue to explore the untold stories behind the crime scenes.